Hello, I'm Rob Coston from Nautilus International, the trade union for maritime professionals. Nautilus International is an affiliate of the International Transport Workers Federation, which represents seafarers on the global stage. And one of the most important jobs that's done by the ITF is that it employs a set of inspectors all around the world. And their job is to go on board vessels and make sure that seafarers receive the treatment they're entitled to. That means everything from food to cleanliness on board to making sure they're receiving their wages. It runs that whole spectrum. So to find out a bit more about that again, I'm talking today to a recently qualified ITF inspector who's taken on the job. That's Helen Meldrum. Helen, thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me along today, Rob. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So perhaps we could get started with the role you're doing. What area of the world do you cover, and what do you do in that role?
So I'm the Scottish ITF inspector. I think that's self-explanatory in the area that I cover. Basically from the borders on the left to the borders on the right of Scotland is what I cover. So it's a really large area. I think a lot of people don't realise how big Scotland is until you've got to drive around it for a living. So yeah. And essentially our role is to carry out routine inspections mostly on vessels, flags of convenience, and that's to make sure that seafarers are in receipt, as you mentioned already, of correct wages, good terms and conditions, good conditions on board, things like that. So that's essentially the nuts and bolts of the role, but there's a lot more to it. We look at things like provisions, making sure something simple as that, making sure that people have sleep in. That's one of the things that we can come across sometimes. Making sure that water is available on board, and I can't believe we're saying that in 2025, but we need to make sure that people have decent nutritional food and are actually getting access to safe drinking water as well. So yeah, it's a combination of a number of things. In addition to that, we also build relationships with lots of organisations as well, and that includes governmental organisations, charities, everyone who's involved in the well-being of seafarers, essentially. So it's a really broad view of what we do. And that's essentially the main part of the role.
Yeah, so in Scotland, what kind of mix of seafarers are you getting on those flag of convenience vessels? Where are they from? Perhaps what sectors are they working in? And what are some of the common issues you encounter?
So, I mean, the predominantly seafarers that we're getting on the flags of convenience are probably Filipinos at this stage. I know that, Indian seafarers are increasing a lot as well at the moment. So that I think over the next few years, as they develop in their training, we'll see a lot more Indian officers that'll be on these vessels.
And
We do have, of course, we've got offshore in terms of oil and gas, renewables, all of these things that are common to Scotland. A lot of fishing as well, although we don't deal with those really that often unless there's a complaint from a fishing vessel. So in addition, obviously we've got everything else that everyone else sees. So we have bulk carriers, all of these sorts of things. In reality, the offshore vessels predominantly are flying sort of Norwegian flags. We don't really have that many offshore vessels that are coming in with flags of convenience, so it's predominantly cargo vessels that I deal with. We don't even see that many bulk carriers that they do elsewhere in the UK. So for example, our Welsh inspector, she will see a lot of car carriers. That's not something I would ever see. It's amazing actually how different, even in the ports that we cover in the UK, how different the vessels are.
yeah, and I guess that means you might get some different issues being reported than some of the other inspectors. I spoke to Matt Parsonage recently, who's our inspector for Northwest England, and he said one of the big things he encounters is seafarers expected to perform duties like lashing and unlashing, and how sometimes, of course, that can be dangerous. Sometimes they're very fatigued and then they're asked to do this extra duty they're not qualified for. So, yeah, what kind of issues do you think you encounter that perhaps some other inspectors don't?
One of the big things for me is on the offshore vessels, so where the UK national minimum wage should apply, for example. I don't think that that's the other inspectors really encounter that often. But that again, that's very difficult to try to manage because you have to look to see where they've been, what ports they've been into, have they been elsewhere? Because if they have, then the national minimum wage might not apply. They then have to pay UK tax on that as well. So it's a bit of tricky legislation to try and get your head around. One that I'm still trying to at the moment. But yeah, I think certainly that's one of the things that we'll be trying to look at as a team across the UK is how and when that national minimum wage should apply. And I think it's actually quite shocking that we have these vessels and seafarers that aren't just routinely paying the national minimum wage at the very least because you expect the wages to be higher, right?
Yeah. Absolutely, you know, it's a difficult job, and it's something Nautilus campaigned on for a long time to try and get these rules to apply. So it's really important that somebody's out there enforcing them now. I think one of the things that surprised me hearing about this role is how much of it is understanding rules and laws and following up paperwork and doing paper trails. Is that something you expected going into the job?
I mean, I did discuss it with a couple of Nautilus colleagues prior to starting the role. So, and in my training as well as an inspector, a big part of that training was around the paperwork, how to deal with that. But again, there's a lot of obfuscation in the industry. So it's a shame to say it, but there are deliberate attempts by some unscrupulous companies to try to make it difficult for people like us and other organisations to determine whether or not that individual's being paid properly. There's some double accounting going on, for example. There are some vessels that you've got strong suspicion that there's contracts and wage accounts being provided to you. If you speak to one of the seafarers, and they maybe tell you they've got a different contract, but they're too scared to speak up. And that can be really, really tricky.
Yeah, no, that's really serious, and we know, of course, there's a really serious culture around adjusting working hours, falsifying that kind of paperwork that's endemic in the industry. And if you got a case like that coming in where you suspect something like that's going on, what would your approach be to that? How would you try and resolve that issue?
One of the most important things is to build trust between yourself and the seafarers. And I think I see that more and more. It's maybe just that I'm getting used to a little bit more, getting used to seafarers and how they perceive us. One of the things that I really enjoy about my job is how everyone, a majority of people, are really happy to see you. So I think there's that. Seafarers really have a lot of trust in the ITF. So it's about being able to get them to open up. Trying to get some seafarers on their own can be really difficult. If, for example, a chief officer and the master are also unhappy about wages, if they feel that there's something going on in relation to their wages, they're not being paid correctly, then that makes life a lot easier for us, because they are more than willing to provide us with the paperwork, to point out exactly where things aren't going right. If there's complaints from the crew and the master and the chief officer, for example, aren't on board with it, it can be much more difficult, because one of the things that surprised me is how afraid people are to speak up because for fear of blacklisting in the industry. Not being from a maritime background, this is all new to me, and I find that really shocking, actually, that even now, people feel that they may be blacklisted and can't get work in the future.
So in order to counter that, I know that quite often you have to work with people and keep their names out of it, ensure they're anonymous. I just wanted, perhaps you could comment on that. Like, how do you do that? How do you get through to the company if perhaps people are not willing to put their name to it for understandable reasons?
When there's an ITF agreement on board that vessel, part of that agreement is that the paperwork is shared with us. So even if someone speaks to us whilst on board, but they wish to remain anonymous, that helps us and look for exactly what the issue is. And then we can raise that with the company separately. When someone is contacting you and they're on a vessel and it's miles away, hundreds of miles away, and they're also asking to remain anonymous, that's a bit trickier. It's just about trying to make sure that, you know, the language is clear enough and you're trying to highlight issues in relation to the agreement, you know, what plans do they have in place for repatriation, for example, for seafarers who are coming to the end of their contracts. These sorts of things, it's just a way of trying to be in each individual case on how can I do this without identifying someone. Sometimes it's impossible, you know, if there's an electrician on board, for example, who wants to be repatriated, but they don't want to be identified. That is all, you know, that is very difficult. But again, it would be around what are your plans and make it as broad as you possibly can. But often the company is going to know that they've tried to raise it with you. So
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's good to know that you always do your best to protect it. And I guess in the case where they might be identified, you would warn them in advance or seek their permission before going ahead with that.
oh yeah, of course, every time, you know, and sometimes they will just decide, no, I don't want to, and that's fine. We will sometimes then ask for onward ports, maybe try and get an ITF inspector in that particular port to do a routine inspection if one hasn't been carried out. You know, there's or contact other organisations as well that are carrying out welfare checks. These are the sorts of things that we can do, and that, you know, that all comes back to the relationships that we build along the way to try to be able to protect and help the seafarers as much as we possibly can.
Thank you. So you mentioned a couple of things there that people might approach you about. I wonder if there are any others that you'd like to flag up, you know, so that people are aware if they're having that problem, that they can come to an ITF inspector about it.
So there's the seafarer support section in the ITF who are excellent. I've actually been helping out there for a couple of weeks, and I'm absolutely amazed by how many emails I receive every day, hundreds of emails every day from seafarers around the world, and the work that they do is incredible. I just, you know, what we do is a tiny drop in the ocean compared to the work that they're carrying out every single day. And I hope that they, you know, it'd be nice to see them getting some recognition for that as well. But again, the seafarer support section is an area in which we have good relationships with too. So they would contact us about a vessel that's in our area. If it's a vessel that we have been in contact with previously, these sorts of things we can do. We also have an ITF Seafarers app that you can download on your phone from the Apple Store or Play Store, and it will tell you who your ITF inspectors are if you're coming into a port, for example, or a country. It has their contact details, and it also can tell you if you're thinking about going on a vessel for employment. It will also tell you if there's recently been an ITF inspection on that vessel, when the last time that was carried out. And importantly, I think, is if there's an ITF agreement on that vessel, because most of the time that means that the terms and conditions are protected as much as we possibly can. You know, it's not perfect, and there are sometimes things that we can pick up along the way, but these vessels are looked after, and we have good relationships with the companies that we can able to get things resolved if something goes wrong.
Great. I wonder if you could give me just a bit of an insight into your work as a case happens. Is there anything that you've worked on that you feel particularly proud of or happy with, where you're able to get a resolution for a seafarer?
Um, I think one of the very first cases one of the very first vessels that I stepped on, you know, feeling a little bit nervous. I was trying to exude that air of confidence in what I was doing, and I still I realised there was something not quite right on that vessel. I just couldn't quite put my finger on it. So one of the fortunate things that we can do, or one of the things that we can do that's helpful, is we can take the paperwork away. You know, I can take a copy of everything, especially if there's an agreement on board that vessel. And I was able to take it away and just sort of methodically go through all of that. And it turned out a young man had been employed as a cadet, but he should have been an AB. And I worked out, it was on his Siemens book, all of these sorts of things, and got him a promotion and $2,500 in back pay. Although it took me a few days to work out what he was doing, how to do it. You know, and that's at that point that I thought, I can do this job, you know, this is something that's really fantastic. So that I think will always stick in my mind, that first one. And I pulled on a lot of resources able to work out how to get to the end of that. But that was incredible. I'm pleased to say that, you know, a lot of the cases that I deal with are fairly low level, the ones that are coming to the UK. I mean, you did mention the lashing, that is an issue, certainly. But a lot of the things are fairly low level, some small amounts of unpaid overtime, PPE that has been PPE costs that's been deducted from paying it shouldn't have, these sorts of things, you know. I mean, $278 in someone's pocket is better than theirs than it is in the shipping companies. But I have been dealing with some abandonment cases for the last sort of few months as well. And one of the ones that I dealt with around October, November was a vessel off the coast of Georgia where the crew hadn't been paid for 2 months. They had no food, water, fuel, anything at all. And ITF actually paid for them to get provisions. I arranged it with a local agent in Georgia, and they were able to get provisions. And then I also managed to get the crew paid, and it was a back payment for 2 months of $47,000. And that, you know, I find it incredible that these are the sorts of amounts of money that aren't being paid routinely to crews. And I've had a couple of good results actually with abandonment cases that I've been really quite proud of. There was one company that I was dealing with that was a bit of a serial offender, and you know, one that ITF is well aware of, but I just happened to pick up 26 vessels. And I happened to pick up 3 of those vessels, and you know, they don't respond to you. The company doesn't respond. The flag state often doesn't respond. And sometimes you feel you're never getting anywhere with this. But with my organiser's hat on from where I used to be involved in the trade union, I thought the only way that we can deal with this is a bit of publicity. I think we need to, you know, get that. And the Associated Press and the ITF, we did an article on that particular company, managed to get the videos and pictures out there of the conditions that the seafarers were having to deal with on board. And whilst I know their vessels, and there's probably lots of seafarers that are on those vessels currently who are really struggling and who are essentially imprisoned on these vessels in a lot of cases, the ones who were in contact with me were all repaid, repatriated, you know, and what's amazing is they periodically message me just to let me know how they're getting on, and always saying thank you, you know, they wish you Merry Christmas, all of these sorts of things. It's really, really worthwhile.
Yeah, that must make the hard work of the job feel much better when you realize that you've made that kind of difference for people. And
Yeah.
sadly, we know it's an increasing problem, abandonment at the moment. And ITF is almost the only organization fighting back against it and helping people. So it really is important work.
Yeah, when you look at the database of who's reporting the abandonment cases, you know, it's like 99.5% are being reported by the ITF, but it is shocking. I mean, it's daily that abandonment cases are being reported, and there has to be some sort of shift in governments and political will to be able to start to try to tackle this.
Yeah, so I know that the ITF inspectors, obviously you will set a particular region that you work in, but also you each are assigned abandonment cases around the world to deal with. If there is a suspected case of abandonment that somebody hears about, who should they go to at the ITF to get that reported, to get that flagged up and start the process of dealing with it?
Most of these cases come into the seafarer support email address. It's seafsupport@itf.org.uk. The majority of those come in. Having said that, when I was dealing with the first abandonment case in the notorious company that I just mentioned, all of the Indian seafarers on all of those vessels all speak to each other. They're in WhatsApp groups with one another. So because I got a result on one ship, I then started getting WhatsApp messages from other ships. So it's either contacting the seafarer support or even contacting some ITF inspectors. There's about roughly 150 of us in the world, and we do all talk to each other when we need to as well. And if we see that there's a vessel coming into someone's port or anything at all, it is a really, although it's a worldwide team, it's a close-knit team. Contact an ITF inspector, download the app, or email seafarer support, and we will look at your case.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Helen. What I'm going to do is put the details, the contact details, and where to find the app in the liner notes for this video. And once again, thank you very much for talking to me about your job.
Thanks very much, Rob.